What would you do if someone in power used their position to mistreat someone? Have you ever wondered if justice could really come back around, even when it seems impossible? And what if this so-called authority figure never saw it coming? In today's story, we're about to dive into a shocking event where a principal, trusted to protect and uplift students, does the exact opposite. But here's the twist. Within just 5 minutes, his life is turned upside down. Stay with us to uncover exactly how karma delivered swift justice in a way no one saw coming. This isn't just another story of a person in power going too far. It's a reminder that every action has consequences, and sometimes they strike back in ways that can't be undone. So how does a school principal go from respected to ruined in just minutes? What drives him to act in such an unfair, unjust way against one of his students? And most importantly, how does he end up facing the very fate he wanted to avoid? We're about to explore these questions, peeling back the layers of this story to show you just how powerful karma can be. This video isn't just about the downfall of one individual. It's about the ripple effects of abuse of power, the reality of prejudice in places meant to be safe, and the resilience of those who stand up against it. If you've ever wondered whether life has a way of balancing the scales, or if karma really strikes back, you're going to want to stick around until the very end. By the close of this story, you'll see why no one, no matter their title or position, is above facing the consequences of their actions. So buckle in, because the next few minutes may just change how you see justice and karma forever. It was an ordinary day at Riverdale High. Students shuffled through the hallways, the walls lined with lockers echoing with the sounds of books slamming shut, laughter, and conversations blending into a familiar hum. But behind the familiar scenes of everyday school life, there was an undercurrent, a tension, almost invisible, but very much felt. And this tension was especially thick whenever Principal Harding walked through the halls. Principal Mark Harding was a man known by all, not because he was beloved, but because his presence commanded a certain uneasy respect. He wasn't the type of principal who offered encouraging words or gave high fives to students passing by. No, Principal Harding ruled with an iron grip. His stern expressions, piercing gaze, and strict enforcement of rules earned him a reputation that kept most students on edge. Even teachers hesitated when speaking to him, choosing their words carefully, avoiding eye contact for too long. It was as if his position of power was something he enjoyed reminding everyone of, just by walking past them. In the midst of this environment was Maya, a bright, young student in her sophomore year. Maya was well known for her kindness, her intelligence, and her ambition. She'd worked hard to keep up her grades, joined various clubs, and had a genuine passion for learning. She was the type of student any school would be proud to have, quietly hardworking, never causing trouble. But Maya had something that, despite her good nature, seemed to catch Principal Harding's eye. She was confident, perhaps even too confident for his liking. It wasn't long before Principal Harding found reasons to single her out, although at first they seemed minor. He'd question her if he saw her standing in the hallway for too long, or he'd scrutinize her appearance under the guise of school policy. Other students noticed, too. Whispers started circulating. Why does he keep targeting her? Some speculated that he didn't like her because she spoke her mind when asked to, or maybe because she was different from the other students he usually targeted. But no one could quite put a finger on it. All they knew was that something felt wrong. One morning, Maya walked into school like any other day, unaware that today would be different. As she made her way through the hallway, books clutched close to her chest, she could feel Principal Harding's gaze burning into her from across the hall. She glanced over, trying not to look too bothered, but his eyes never left her. It was unsettling. Maya had learned to ignore his looks, his questioning, and even his cold remarks. But today felt different. The tension was thicker, the hallway seemed quieter, and Principal Harding's gaze felt even heavier. Without warning, he called out her name, his voice echoing through the hallway. Everyone around froze, eyes shifting between Maya and the principal, wondering what could have sparked his attention this time. Maya turned, swallowing hard, putting on a brave face as she approached him. Her heart pounded, but she maintained her composure. She'd done nothing wrong, she reminded herself. But Principal Harding's glare told her that didn't matter. He wasted no time. With a firm, almost rehearsed tone, he began accusing her of things she hadn't done, disrespecting the rules, skipping classes, even questioning her attitude in a way that felt more personal than professional. It was as if he built a case against her in his mind, a list of wrongs that only he could see. Maya tried to defend herself, speaking up with a steady voice, but he wasn't having it. Each word she spoke seemed to anger him more, his face twisting into a mask of disdain. Students gathered around, their eyes wide as they witnessed the interaction. Some looked away, uncomfortable, while others murmured amongst themselves. How could this be happening to Maya of all people? The girl who was always kind, always respectful, was now being painted as a problem. Maya could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers around her, but most of all, she felt the burning humiliation as the principal continued to list her supposed offenses. Then, in a chilling moment, Principal Harding looked her in the eye and said, "If you can't follow the rules, maybe this isn't the place for you." His words struck like a slap. She couldn't believe it. He was dismissing her, telling her she no longer belonged in the very school she'd worked so hard to excel in. The shock was written all over her face, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. She wanted to defend herself, to tell him he was wrong, but no words came. All she could feel was the sting of embarrassment, the hot rush of anger, and the helplessness of standing before someone who had already decided her fate. Principal Harding didn't wait for her response. He turned his back on her, leaving her standing alone in the hallway, her dignity shattered, her sense of safety ripped away in an instant. She was left staring at his retreating figure, her mind racing, her heart broken. The students who had gathered quickly dispersed, some giving her sympathetic glances, others avoiding her gaze altogether. Maya could feel the tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. It was a day Maya would never forget. The morning started like any other. She had no idea that within hours, her world would be turned upside down. She entered her first class, smiled at a few friends, and settled into her usual seat. But the strange looks and whispers around her hinted that something was brewing. There was a tension she couldn't quite put her finger on, a sense of something lurking just around the corner. Suddenly, during the break, her heart sank as she heard her name blare through the loudspeaker. "Maya Thompson, report to the principal's office." Those words echoed through the hallways, catching everyone's attention. Students exchanged curious glances, whispering to each other, as Maya felt every eye in the room fall on her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. What could this be about? She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, yet there was a sinking feeling in her stomach as she gathered her things and headed toward the principal's office. As Maya approached the door, it felt like the world was moving in slow motion. Her footsteps seemed loud against the tiled floor, each step echoing down the hallway. Finally, she reached the office, and with a hesitant knock, she entered. There sat Principal Harding behind his massive, imposing desk, his cold gaze fixed on her the moment she walked in. His expression was unreadable, but Maya could sense the hostility radiating from him. She felt like a child caught in the crosshairs, unarmed and unprepared. "Close the door," he instructed, his voice clipped and icy. Maya obeyed, swallowing the knot of anxiety forming in her throat. She tried to maintain her composure, standing tall, determined not to show her fear. But deep down, she could feel the weight of what was coming. Principal Harding's gaze never softened. Without preamble, he started to list a series of accusations that seemed to come out of nowhere. He accused her of breaking school rules, causing disruptions in class, and being disrespectful to teachers. Each accusation struck like a blow, leaving Maya stunned and speechless. This couldn't be happening, she thought. Was he talking about someone else? She opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain that none of what he was saying was true. but he silenced her with a raised hand. "Maya," he said with a look of distaste, "I don't want to hear excuses. This school has no room for students who refuse to follow the rules." His tone was final, absolute, as if her fate had been decided long before she stepped into the room. Maya felt her chest tighten, her throat constricting as she struggled to hold back tears. She knew none of this was fair, but every time she tried to speak, he cut her off, his words sharp and dismissive. The more she tried to defend herself, the angrier he seemed to get, as if her very presence was an affront to him. "You have a choice," he sneered. "Either you leave willingly, or I'll make it official and expel you myself." The word expel hung in the air, heavy and damning. The realization washed over her like a wave of cold water. She could feel the weight of that word pressing down on her. Expelled, she'd be marked forever, her academic record tainted, her reputation destroyed. She thought of her parents, her friends, her dreams of going to college. She thought of all the times she'd studied late, stayed out of trouble, followed every rule. And yet, here she was, about to lose everything because of one man's misguided judgment. As she looked up, she saw no remorse in his eyes, no sympathy. His expression was one of satisfaction, as if he'd just won some invisible battle. For a moment, Maya wondered if this had been his plan all along. Had he been watching her, waiting for a chance to make her an example? She could feel her heart pounding, her palms sweaty, but she fought to keep her face calm, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he delivered the final blow. "This school has standards, Maya. You clearly don't meet them. I suggest you gather your things and leave before I have to make this official." He delivered his words with such cold detachment that it took everything in Maya to keep standing, to not collapse under the weight of the moment. Her mind raced with questions she didn't dare to voice. Why is he doing this? What did I ever do to deserve this? But she knew she'd find no answers here. All she saw before her was a man wielding his power like a weapon, unchallenged and unchecked. The silence stretched between them, heavy and tense. Maya felt the lump in her throat grow, but she bit back her tears, determined to walk out of that office with her head held high. She gave him one last look, a mixture of defiance and hurt, as if to say, "You may have won this moment, but you haven't won me." With shaky hands, she turned on her heel and left his office, feeling the weight of the door close behind her, like a final sentence. As she walked through the hallways, she noticed the eyes of her classmates on her, whispering, their faces a mix of sympathy and shock. She forced herself to keep moving, each step heavier than the last, her mind still spinning from the injustice of it all. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something about this was deeply wrong, that she was caught in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She replayed the conversation over and over, searching for any hint of fairness or reason, but found none. She was no troublemaker, no delinquent. She was just a girl who had tried to do her best, yet here she was, shunned and humiliated for reasons she couldn't understand. As she reached her locker, she felt the enormity of what had just happened crash over her. Her mind buzzed with questions, but there were no answers, only the harsh reality that her life had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. The future she had worked so hard for now seemed out of reach, slipping away because of one person's prejudice, one person's decision to act as judge, jury, and executioner. In that moment, as she stood alone in the hallway, Maya realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had ever been silenced by someone in power. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity. She was standing up against a system that had let people like Principal Harding abuse their authority unchecked. Principal Harding sat back in his office chair, a smug satisfaction spreading across his face as Maya left the room. The heavy silence that followed her departure felt like victory to him. For Harding, this wasn't just a matter of enforcing the rules, it was personal. He'd seen Maya's resilience, her confidence, and, in some twisted way, those qualities seemed to threaten him. She wasn't like other students, the ones who cowered under his stern gaze or muttered yes "Sir," without a second thought. No, Maya was different. She had a spark, a quiet strength he couldn't put out. And for someone like Harding, that was unacceptable. As he leaned back, he reflected on the exchange, replaying each moment with a strange sense of triumph. He didn't feel an ounce of guilt for what he'd done. If anything, he felt it was justified. She had it coming, he thought, his eyes narrowing as he glanced out the office window, watching the students pass by in the hallway. To him, enforcing the rules was more than just policy. It was a way to assert his authority, to remind everyone who was in charge. And Maya's courage, her unwavering stance, had been a challenge he felt compelled to crush. He liked the power he wielded, the way students would go silent when he walked into a room, the way they lowered their heads when he spoke to them. It was as if he fed off their fear and submission, using it to fuel his own ego. Principal Harding believed he was untouchable, that no one could question him. He had carefully cultivated an image of strictness, of unwavering discipline, and he held on to it with an iron grip. The thought of any student, especially one like Maya, challenging his authority was something he could not allow. He'd made an example out of her, and to him, that was a job well done. He knew that word would spread quickly among the students, and they would think twice before testing the boundaries. He was sure his actions would serve as a warning. No one steps out of line without consequences, not in his school. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the scene in the hallways. He could almost hear the whispers, the looks of shock on the students' faces as Maya walked out, defeated. He pictured them sharing stories, exaggerating the details, spreading fear. Good, he thought. They should be afraid. That fear would make them easier to control, less likely to push back or question him. In Harding's mind, he was simply maintaining order, ensuring that every student knew their place. But Harding's lack of remorse went deeper than just his desire for control. There was something darker, an underlying resentment he held, particularly towards students like Maya, students who didn't fit his mold of what was acceptable. Maya was intelligent, driven, and well-liked by her peers, qualities he saw as potential threats rather than assets. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow challenging his authority just by being herself, by having the courage to hold her head high, no matter how many times he tried to bring her down. Harding had spent years building his reputation as a strict, no-nonsense principal, and he wasn't about to let anyone jeopardize it. Over time, he'd come to see himself as more than just an administrator. In his mind, he was the gatekeeper of the school's values, the one responsible for shaping young minds and enforcing discipline. Yet, in reality, his approach was more about exerting control than fostering respect. He didn't care about helping students grow or understand their mistakes. He cared about obedience, about bending them to his will. After Maya left, Harding didn't even take a moment to consider her side of the story, or to question whether he had been fair. To him, fairness wasn't the point. In his eyes, Maya's confidence was the problem, her unwillingness to shrink back and stay quiet. And he wasn't about to let her, or anyone else, change that. As far as he was concerned, she was just another troublemaker who needed to be put in her place. Outside his office, the school day continued as usual. Students shuffled between classes, teachers gave their lessons, and the bell rang, marking each period. But Harding remained in his office, feeling strangely triumphant. His mind was already racing, thinking about his next move, considering the next student who might need correcting. The sense of power he felt after his encounter with Maya seemed to fuel him, making him feel invincible, untouchable. But as the day wore on, a nagging feeling began to creep into the back of his mind. It was subtle at first, just a hint of discomfort, as if something were slightly out of place. He brushed it off, blaming it on the long hours, the stress of running a school. Yet, as he sat alone in his office, the feeling grew stronger, a faint whisper reminding him that his actions weren't as justified as he wanted to believe. But he quickly silenced it. Harding wasn't the type to second-guess himself, and he certainly wasn't about to start now. He had built his career on being the authority, on never backing down, and he couldn't afford to show weakness, not to anyone, especially not to himself. So he shook off the doubt, hardened his expression, and convinced himself that he was in the right, that his actions were nothing more than the enforcement of the rules. But as the shadows lengthened outside his window and the day drew to a close, that faint whisper of discomfort remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. And though he tried to ignore it, something deep within him sensed that his actions, his lack of remorse, would come back to haunt him. In his mind, he could still see Maya's face as she'd walked out of his office, hurt but unbroken, a look he couldn't quite shake. Principal Harding left his office that day, feeling smug, assured that he'd rid himself of a problem student. He didn't know that fate had its own plan, something that would turn his sense of control upside down within minutes. As he walked through the emptying hallways, his mind drifted back to the look on Maya's face, that moment of shock and pain when he delivered his harsh words. He felt no guilt, only satisfaction, until he reached the front of the school building, where a small crowd was gathered. He stopped, his expression souring as he recognized one of the figures standing in the middle of the crowd, Maya's mother. She stood tall, her arms crossed, her face a mask of determination and quiet anger. Her presence was enough to draw attention, and a few students and teachers nearby stopped to watch. Some whispered to each other, glancing nervously at Harding, who was now frozen in place, wondering if this would escalate. Maya's mother stepped forward, her gaze unwavering, her voice strong. "Mr. Harding, I'd like a word," she called out, loud enough for everyone around to hear. The crowd hushed, the suspense thickening as she waited for his response. Harding, caught off guard, but determined to maintain his authority, walked over, trying to mask his irritation with a look of forced politeness. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson," he asked, his voice cold, trying to sound in control. But Maya's mother didn't flinch. She met his gaze with an intensity that made him feel, for the first time, a hint of unease. "I'd like an explanation," she said, her tone steady, calm yet powerful. "Why did you throw my daughter out of school today? Maya has done nothing to deserve this treatment, and I will not stand by while you try to ruin her future." Her voice carried a weight that Harding hadn't anticipated. The spectators held their breath, eager to see how this confrontation would unfold. Harding straightened his shoulders, trying to maintain his authoritative stance. "Your daughter broke the rules," he said, his voice steady, but lacking the confidence he displayed earlier. "She's been disruptive, disrespectful to teachers. We have standards here, and she clearly doesn't meet them." But Maya's mother wasn't buying it. She knew her daughter. She knew Maya was respectful, hardworking, and kind. The accusations Harding made didn't match the person she knew, and she could see through the thin veil of authority he was trying to hold over her. "I think the only thing Maya has done wrong," she said, her voice rising just enough to be heard clearly, "is stand up for herself. And it's clear to me that you see that as a threat." At that moment, whispers rippled through the crowd, students exchanging glances as they realized they weren't alone in their suspicions. Harding's face began to turn red, a mix of anger and embarrassment rising within him. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut through the air, a teacher from the back of the crowd, stepping forward. "Mrs. Thompson is right," the teacher said, her voice firm but sympathetic. "Maya's always been a good student. I can't stand by and let her be unfairly punished." The teacher's words struck a chord with the crowd, and more students and staff began to nod, murmuring their agreement. In that moment, the tide had turned against Principal Harding, the very authority he'd built his career on crumbling before his eyes. Harding's mask of confidence cracked. He tried to defend himself, stumbling over his words as he repeated the same accusations he'd thrown at Maya earlier. But each word sounded weaker, more hollow. He could feel his control slipping away, the respect he once commanded melting under the weight of the truth. The crowd around him grew, voices rising as students began to share their own stories. One student spoke up about the time Harding had unfairly given him detention, another about how he'd been reprimanded for a minor infraction, while other students went unpunished. It became clear that Maya wasn't the only one who had suffered under Harding's reign. One by one, voices emerged from the crowd, each testimony exposing Harding's abuse of power and lack of empathy. In the midst of this gathering, Harding felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. He realized, too late, that his actions had consequences he could no longer control. He'd spent years believing he was untouchable, but now, faced with the collective voices of students, parents, and even staff, he felt small, powerless. Maya's mother looked him squarely in the eyes, a final blow of truth. You may be the principal, but you don't own these students. You are supposed to protect them, support them, not crush them for your own satisfaction. Her words hung in the air, echoing through the crowd and searing into Harding's mind. There was no going back now. His authority, once so secure, now lay in pieces. But the real blow came moments later when the superintendent, alerted by the commotion, arrived on the scene. He had heard rumors before, whispers of Harding's harsh methods, but he'd never seen them unfold so plainly. As he listened to the crowd, his face darkened, disappointment evident in his eyes. Harding tried to explain, stumbling over his words, trying to justify his actions, but it was no use. The superintendent, stern but fair, didn't want to hear excuses. He turned to Harding, his voice firm and resolute. This isn't how we treat students, Principal Harding. I think it's time you take a leave to reconsider your methods. We will be reviewing your conduct thoroughly. The crowd fell silent, absorbing the weight of the superintendent's words. In a matter of minutes, Harding's world had collapsed around him. The respect, the control, the untouchable reputation he built had all been shattered by the very people he thought he controlled. He stood there, exposed and vulnerable, stripped of his authority in front of the very students he'd once tried to dominate. As Harding walked away, defeated, he could feel the stares of the crowd on his back, their eyes piercing through the empty shell of authority he had once wrapped himself in. He knew he would never walk these halls the same way again, that his title of principal was now nothing more than a label, stripped of the respect it once carried.